They used Indian troops, Indian systems to capture India. They always said Indian officers cannot lead the Indian army. It is the British officer who can lead the Indian army. Kashmir was always going to be an issue. If you think you're sitting in, a particular part of country which has not had problems, you're slightly mistaken, because every area, it flares up every now and then. If you want to walk alone and survive in this world, you better carry a big stick. That's the only way to do it. And the only way to do it is to understand exactly who we are, where we are. Well, thank you all. It's an honor to be in Ahmedabad and to be talking to students of the Indus University. And I today will be taking you through the post-independent period of India's history, where we have fought four major wars, which kind of shaped the destiny of this country. There have been more wars after that, but we will not get into those. The main topic today is covering 1962, which was fought with China, and then 1965, which was fought with Pakistan. These two books I have written, 1962, The War That Wasn't, which has now become the kind of most definitive work on the war because it took a lot of research, almost 35 years of real solid work, which put it all together. And the 65 book is called The Western Sunrise. But before I come to 62 and 65, it would be perhaps it is necessary for me to also dwell a little bit on the 1947-48, what is known as the Jammu and Kashmir operations. And after that, we will round up with a short, brief summary of what actually happened in 1971, where India as a nation, as a military power, as an army, came of age. Now, in the previous talk, so you have elaborated on how the West has literally taken over our entire education system, whether it was business ethics or whether it was business studies or whether it was business practices. But the West has completely and absolutely taken over our entire military system also. It is not that we did not have military systems before the arrival of the French and the British and the European powers. In fact, we had far more complex military systems. Even the British, when they finally came to power in India and the Raj came into being, have taken Maharaja Ranjit Singh's, that was the contemporary thing at that time. They've taken his model, implemented it, worked out their own military strategic aspects into it, and we have inherited all that. The irony is they used Indian troops, Indian systems to capture India. And then when they left us with this terrible feeling that we simply had to continue and live up to their expectations. They always said Indian officers cannot lead the Indian army. It is the British officer who can lead the Indian army. और ये अंग्रेज थे कौन? They were bachas who had no education compared to the kind of people we had. Yet, what you talked about decolonizing your mind, we needed to decolonize ourselves as far as the armed forces were concerned. And to a great extent, that is the process we will be going over right now. We became independent. There's a lot which has been said about how India got its independence because of non-violence, because of Gandhiji. Mahatma Gandhi played a role, but Mahatma Gandhi was not the only defining factor in India's independence. In fact, one of the reasons why the British, there were three reasons why the British left. One was what happened with the INA, the Indian National Army, where for the first time they began to realize that Indians are not blindly going to follow them. So though the impact of Subhash Chandra Bose's actual fighting backed by the Japanese, etc., may not have had a very major impact on the fighting with the 14th Army in Burma, the fact that Indian troops were willing to fight against the British shook the empire. The second was the naval mutiny that took place in 1946 in Bombay, where again, the British being a sea power actually literally gave up. That's when they started thinking that we need to get out of India. However, there are two things which you need to know before we get into 47, 48. Our history has been told to us in such a warped manner that a lot of our stuff is not known. We all believe that in 1932, or during the second roundtable conference, the word Pakistan came up for the first time. Now, this is not true because after World War One in 1917, when Indian troops, by the way, in World War One defined warfare. The European powers were just stuck in that whole trench warfare business. It's the Garhwali troops who actually broke the systems. But why were Indian troops fighting for the British the way they did? Because they had been promised something in return. Now, we don't know this because we are not taught this. In fact, the entire thing was that Indians will be given self-rule for the role that they play. Not independence, self-rule. So when they came back, they actually expected major political developments for having served the king and country and all that kind of stuff. But hua kya? In 1919, we had Jallianwala Bagh, Rowlatt Act, this, that, etc. It was brutal, the whole thing, and the entire thing collapsed. The British at that time, in 1919, drew up a paper which was written by a chap called Colonel Minderjan, German name, British officer, working for the colonial office. They had the colonial office and they had the war office. Colonial office became MI5, war office became MI6, or the other way around. They worked out a paper at that time which divided India into three parts: Hindustan, Pakistan, or Princestan. And in that they said, Princestan will never happen, but we will use it as a bargaining chip with the Congress to form Pakistan. मैं 1919 की बात कर रहा हूँ. This is 13 years before our history admits the fact that Pakistan came up for the first time, where Rahmat Ali spoke about Pakistan as a country. This plan was put up to the House of Lords. It was dropped. They said no, because the British like to give this impression of playing cricket and playing very fair and all that. So this was something devious. They didn't want to do it because it meant the creation of Pakistan. Why did they want to create Pakistan? The wells of power. They needed the oil. They needed control over that time Persia, which is now Iran. They needed Bahrain because Bahrain was a major refueling center, oil refinery, and they needed a foot in Iraq. And they knew that if they are completely kicked out of the Indian subcontinent, they will never have access to that oil. That was one very major factor. Keep that in the back of your mind. The second point, which is very important, is that during World War II, when Churchill was desperate to bring the United States into the war, there was a meeting between him and President Roosevelt in somewhere off Newfoundland of Canada. The British were begging the Americans to come in. The Americans were saying, we'll give you ships, we'll give you warships, we'll give you tanks, we'll do this, but we will not fight. They said, you have to come into the war. Roosevelt told Churchill, if you want us to enter the war, we will come in on one condition. Any of you know what that condition was? India has to be given independence. Roosevelt was not hung up about Indians. He had nothing to do. It was not an Indian thing. In fact, in some of his speeches, he refers to us as blackies and stuff like that. It was because the Americans knew that if they come into the war, they will have to break the back of colonialism. And if colonialism continues after World War II, the Americans will remain a secondary power and the United States and the Great Britain will carry on being Great Britain, and that's the end of it. So the first condition which was put, and I've covered this in an earlier book of mine called The Long Road to Siachen, where he categorically says, and it's been documented by his son, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his ADC, and he says to Churchill, he says, look, colonialism has to go. So the whole thing was, there were a lot of wheels within wheels, and this is what geopolitics is all about actually. And Churchill is also the man who got hold of Jinnah Jinnah in 1934, after the Pakistan thing had come up and the Muslim League thing had come up, had been insulted by Gandhi and by various people in Bhopal or in Nagpur in one of the meetings, and he had left. He had left the country. He was recruited by Churchill with a single point agenda, which was the creation of Pakistan. Churchill's secretary, Judith, was Jinnah's handler. I've written this, and this has been ratified by the Vice Chancellor of the Karachi University. So it's a fact. I mean, we researched it, we came up on this information, we put it up. If I got the information, I'm sure a lot of other people also had it. Now, when this whole thing about Pakistan was created, Kashmir was always going to be an issue. Because Kashmir at that time was a princely state. So when they said we'll give you Pakistan, they could not say we'll give you Pakistan plus Kashmir because that would be not cricket. It would, they had to have the Maharaja go through certain steps, etc., and get into the whole thing. So when Pakistan was created in 1947, the entire carnage took place. The Punjab Boundary Force, which was under the British at that time, did very little to control it. Over 2 million people were killed. 20 lakh people were butchered, both sides. We landed up with Pakistan. But Pakistan without Kashmir meant nothing. And in fact, Jinnah says so. He says, I have inherited a moth-eaten Pakistan. Without Kashmir, I don't exist. And that time, all the routes into Kashmir were through Pakistan, through Muzaffarabad, etc. Here, again, one of those quirks of history. Nehru's relationship with Mountbattens, I use the word Mountbattens and not Mountbatten, resulted in him managing to influence Mountbatten enough to get Gurdaspur into the Indian side. So we had a foot into Kashmir. That saved us. Otherwise, gaya tha. By October, with the Maharaja of Kashmir, who Indian history again vilifies, we say he was a vacillator, he sat on the fence. Maharaja Hari Singh was a remarkable guy. Read about him. In the Princes of Chambers, he had been educated by the British in Mayo College. He was sent there. He was supposed to propagate and look after British interests, but he is the first guy who talks about modern India the way we needed it to be. It's a fantastic speech. The British turned against him. He actually played his own role, whatever it was. There's always black, white, grey. And in his case, there was a lot of grey also. But Maharaja Hari Singh was not willing to hand over to Pakistan. The Muslim conference, the national conference under Sheikh Abdullah at that time, did not want to be a part of Pakistan because Sheikh Abdullah felt that he'll never be able to become as important as Jinnah. So they had their own politics. As a result of which, what happened that in October, the Pakistanis getting fed up of what was going on, and that the fact that Kashmir was not falling into their lap, they had launched these Lakshars into Kashmir, which were tribal columns. They would have swept through, but for two things. One, they got greedy. The column going, forget about the columns going to Punch and Mirpur and Jhangar, where very severe fighting took place. In fact, far more severe than what happened in the valley. But let's stay focused on the Jhangar that came, the one group which went into the valley. They came in, and till they got to Baramulla, they had no problems at all. At Baramulla, they couldn't believe their luck. I mean, they had Baramulla just 30 odd kilometers from Srinagar. The women in Baramulla, even today, that whole belt are very, very pretty. And that actually led to a complete anarchy. Because these fellows started raping all of them. They started picking up all these women. They looted the entire city. They loaded everything into trucks and they went back to Muzaffarabad to drop them and to drop the women. जिनको इन्होंने अपना कैप्टिव बना लिया था. वो जो 2-3 दिन जो हमको मिल गए ना, that is when the Maharaja signed the deed of accession. We started flying in. All the Dakotas started flying in. One Sikh got airlifted. A lot of things happened. And that result, after on the 7th of November, after the airlift began on the 27th of October, just 11 days later, we fought the Battle of Shalatai. where these guys, these raiders, got trapped between our troops, and we even used the Air Force, everything, and we really hammered them. And in fact, there was an absolute carnage. They started falling back. They went up till Uri. And then Nehru made this huge mistake of saying, let's stop at Uri, let's try and relieve Punch. So that line got formed. Now, this line becomes very important because in 1965, even today, that is your line of actual control with Pakistan. 47, 48 meandered for a year. We took the matter to the United Nations. The whole issue came to a grinding halt, and both sides facing each other, a lot of hostility. We had our own baggage now, because what had happened in partition, the fighting, etc., the enmity began. Everything started happening the same. One people now became not only two people, but the fault lines started to cement, and the hatred began. There's no other word for it. It just became India versus Pakistan at every possible level. The irony is, it actually wasn't our fight. It was a fight by the British for their own interests. We inherited it. During the Great Game, which some of you may have heard of, it was the British versus Russia. After World War II, British were a spent power because colonialism went, and Russia, of course, became the Soviet Union. So what the threat to India from Russia went out of the window. It became China. So it became United States versus China. Pakistan became more and more important, and things started to happen. That's one side. That's your Western front. Now let's look at our northern border. In 1947, when we became independent, we did not have a border with China. China was nowhere on the scene. There were Chinese who were on the west coast of the what we know as China today. They were facing the Pacific. We had nothing to do with them. In 1949, that is when the communist Chinese, that is Mao Zedong, they began to overthrow the Kuomintang government, Chiang Kai-shek. These guys were withdrawing, and then they pulled out of the mainland China, went to Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and we suddenly had a different neighbor. We had China. But even then, the communist China, which is known as the PRC. PRC had no borders with India. So, क्या हो रहा है China में? Those days, news was not as common and as easily accessible as it is today. So, what was happening in China really didn't concern us. But then in 1949, Mao Zedong, who by nature, the Chinese communists were expansionists. By nature, they were expansionists. They've got borders with 14 countries. They have problems with all. Whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Cambodia, whether it's Burma, etc. So what they did was, the first thing they did was they annexed Xinjiang. Xinjiang at that point of time was a protectorate of both China and Russia. But when the Chinese said, okay, now Xinjiang has become a part of China, how did it impact us? Because suddenly the state of Jammu and Kashmir had a 1,500-kilometer border with China. And that included the last and the easternmost flank, which is now known as the Aksai Chin. And the Aksai Chin is nothing but a massive wasteland. It's about 17,000 feet is the base height there. The peaks go up much more, but 17,000 feet. It's just solid ice. You try to even dig a hole there, you can't. You hit it, the ground is frozen. The ice axe will bounce back at you. So the first thing that happened was Xinjiang went. When Xinjiang went, world was exhausted. World War II, अब कौन फिर से जाके लड़ाई करेगा, वो भी on something like as desolate as Xinjiang. But the Chinese didn't stop there. In 1950, they annexed Tibet. They called it an autonomous this, they called it this, that, etc. The only country which could have done anything about it at that time was India. Because we had a consulate in Lhasa, and we had an infantry battalion at a place called, which is now beyond Sikkim. We were sitting there in the Chumbi Valley. The Chinese have actually come in from Xinjiang. They could not come from this side. Today they've got railway lines and highways coming, but at that time the only approach was through Xinjiang. So they moved by train along the Russian border, went into Xinjiang, and then they cut across the Aksai Chin and came in. And they came in with a total strength of 5,000 troops to take over Tibet. 5,000 troops is nothing. It's a brigade. Now the irony is that we could have actually stopped them. But at that point of time, was India willing, just recently, we just got our independence. We didn't have food yet. Our own generations, I mean, हमारे time में तो आप लोग, you guys are a different generation today. In our time, if we had a transistor in a house, that house was considered to be affluent. Half of India was starving. We had major problems. We had problems with Pakistan, we had partition, we had this, we had that. The British have left us in a state which was not funny. Half our population were dying. So there was it's when we as historians look back, we say, yes, we should have intervened in Tibet, we should have done this, we should have done that. But actually, you look at, and Nehru is criticized for it to a great extent today. But the fact of the matter is that the compulsions and the circumstances were very different at that time. And Nehru was quite desperate to keep a balance with China because he knew that China is a major power and we cannot take them on the northern frontier. So what did he do? He went in for Panchsheel, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, etc. Whatever the reasons were, he had decided that I am going to try and keep the balance with these guys no matter what. In fact, Nehru went one step further. There were 5,000 soldiers in Lhasa. How were they to survive? Because see, in a place like Tibet in winter, 5,000 आदमियों के लिए आपको चावल नहीं मिलने वाला था उस time. So actually, it is the Nehru sent rice for them through Kalimpong and all that along the old Silk Route. Now, he was trying to maintain that balance, but the fact is that a lot was all beginning to happen at that time, which Nehru got caught. He was trying to maintain this, projecting himself as a man of peace, India's entire image of being the land of Gandhi, non-alignment, this, that, etc. Those contradictions began to catch up with him. Because though he knew what's going on and what the Chinese were up to, there was very little he could do about it publicly. Because you've taken a stand. You say, you make a statement, you say that Hindi Chini bye bye, uske baad aap bologe kya? So the Chinese in the meantime started to build the highway. And they were only interested in Xinjiang and Tibet and the connection which was through the Aksai Chin. Chow En-lai came to India 2-3 times. He used to openly say so. He says, you give me the Aksai Chin, you give me the Aksai Chin, and as a bargaining chip, they started digging up Nifa, which is now Arunachal. And they said, you keep Arunachal, because that was, that is how it was. Nehru said, not an inch of Indian territory, etc., etc., etc. And we finally land up in 1962, where we are now facing a fast developing situation where now a lot of people used to say that we did not know what was coming. We were caught by surprise by the Chinese. We are talking rubbish. We had, as far back as 1951, after the Tibet thing happened, there were 3 major committees which were instituted. Firstly, what happened was Sardar Patel had written a letter to Nehru when the Chinese came into Tibet, where it's an amazing letter. Do get hold of it. It's easily available on the net. Where he says the Chinese have come. All our old treaties with Tibet, our meaning the British Raj treaties with Tibet, will now go out of the window. The Chinese are basically expansionists. This is what they're going to do. This is what they're going to do. This is what they're going to do. And India has to change its policies and take them on. But 17 days later, Sardar Patel died. Sardar Patel's main advisor and the author of that letter was probably a gentleman called V.P. Menon, who was also instrumental in the division of India's states. Once this letter came into being, Nehru had to take action. So he instituted 3 committees. One was the Kalwant Singh Committee. Kalwant Singh was a senior general who was given this task. One was the Himmat Singh Committee. There was a third committee, which I'll come back to later. In the Kalwan Singh Committee report, which was submitted to the government in 1953, Kalwan Singh says, later this man went on to be Western Army commander. He says clearly, we are going to fight China 9 years from now. Why 9 years? Because the build-up is going to take this much time. This. They have to alter the border. They have to do this. They have to do this. This report is there. We all talk about the Henderson Books report being hush-hush. Kalwan Singh report is even more deadly, and it is hush-hush since then because the man predicted what was going to happen. And predictions are not based on Akashvanis like they happen in Indian mythology. These are actually based on actual war studies. एक तो ये था. Second was the Himmat Singh Committee, which looked at the situation in the Northeast. NIFA, which is Arunachal, was at that time administered by the Foreign Affairs Division because the British did not want to treat it as an internal thing. The Indian Army had no jurisdiction over this. This is all rifles. And in fact, the Himmat Singh Committee is the one which first talked about the forward policy and said we have to man the watershed. But the watershed principle is what the border between Tibet and India had been worked out as per the Shimla Agreement of 1914. We went and we manned those places. But manning those places meant holding the watershed is not easy because every post is at 16, 17, 18, 20, 21,000 feet. So you had pockets of soldiers there. And the whole thing was that if the Chinese attack, first line of defense, fall back, fight them on slightly lower terrain. And then, there were methodologies adopted which should have been done. Now, another thing began to happen. Nehru had a major problem. See, Nehru was not an elected prime minister in 1947. He was a nominated prime minister. And in 1951, he fought the first election, and as a nominated prime minister, he had tremendous goodwill. He was going to win in any case, and he had won. There were very few people, the British had ensured that there were very few people who had the same grasp of history or anything who could actually take him on in Parliament. There were people like Kripalani and all that who understood these things, but you've got to understand, we're talking about a time when sitting in Ahmedabad, people would have been so obsessed with the problems Gujarat was facing that they really wouldn't even know what's going on in, Maharashtra they would, but they would not know what's going on in Karnataka or in Kerala because communication, everything was very different. And here we're getting more and more hemmed into this whole kind of a situation. The Chinese are getting more and more aggressive. And Nehru is having to tell more and more lies. Nothing is happening, nothing is happening, nothing is happening. And so when finally the situation began to unfold, by that time he had made one very, very major sin. There's no other word for it. He had started promoting a Kashmiri officer called BG Kaul, as the next big thing in the Indian Army. He had people like Thimaya, he had people like Karyappa, he had people like General Thorat, but BG Kaul, even as a colonel, was used by Nehru, even in 1947-48. He sent him to deal with, you can't bring politics into the army basically, but this officer was used by Nehru to try and build bridges with Sheikh Abdullah, all kinds of things. And after that, his growth in the Indian Army was phenomenal. During World War II, he had not even fought in any of the wars, but Nehru decided he was the next big thing. So he started to supersede a lot of people. And in 1962, he was in a position where he was the de facto chief of the Indian Army. Thorat should have become the chief when Thimaya retired in 1961. They sidelined him because he was very anti-BG Kaul. So BG Kaul was on his way up. Nehru was interfering with the hierarchy in the armed forces. They're beginning to take certain decisions. And the situation was such that the Indian Army, for the first time, was all senior officers at that time were all political appointments. First time it happened. And we paid one hell of a price for it. When the attack came on the 20th of October, should we have been again surprised despite Kulwant Singh report? ठीक है, 9 साल पहले थी. 9 years is a long time, and maybe that report was a fluke. But there was another, even more damning thing. It was called Operation Lal Killa. General Thorat was a Maharashtrian from Kolhapur. He was the Eastern Army commander. He conducted an exercise in Lucknow. That time the Eastern Army Command was in Lucknow. And he predicted to the last T what is going to happen. He said 20 अक्टूबर को आएंगे 1962. This is happening in 1959. Though Lal Killa was in 61, but in 1959 he visited along. My father's battalion was there. My dad remembers this. In fact, my book opens with this. He said, 20 अक्टूबर को आएंगे, they will come from here, they will come from here, they will come from here. These are the routes. This is what is going to happen. How did the man know all this? And in fact, when I started working on this book, his son, Yashwant Thorat, was that time the regional director of RBI in Delhi. I had just filmed the Kargil War. I had just come back, and they had asked me to come and, talk about the Kargil War. And I saw his nameplate, and he looked a bit like the general's photograph. So I asked him. I said, "Are you related to General Thorat?" And he said, "Yes, he was my father." Now I had heard about this Operation Lal Killa, so I actually became quite pally with him, and I said, "Look, have you heard of this exercise?" He said, "Yes, I've heard of it, but there's no documentary evidence of it." So I asked him, I said, where did the general's baggage go after the war? He said, वो सब कोल्हापुर पे है, वहाँ पे वो ऐसे ऐसे वो डब्बों में रखा हुआ है. And in the army, we all families, we all have the same way of packing because we move very often. Every 2 years you're moving. So you have these wooden boxes with number 1, 2, 3, 4, and your dad's first going to put all his official documents in box number 1, then comes the rest of the stuff, etc. So I asked him, I said, "So box number 1 खोल के देखो." And they opened it. And they found this file called Operation Lal Killa. It was lying exactly where I had told Yashwant, वहाँ देखना वहीं निकलेगी, निकल आई. अब ये रिपोर्ट आ गई हमारे पास. We now knew what had been told to the government of India. They had not acted on it. But what was bugging me the most was that Thorat it's not Akashvani. कहाँ से आया ये? So again I went back to Thorat and to Yashwant and I said, "Look, there must be notebooks here." Because there were a lot of mathematical calculations in the columns with pencils. So I told him again, I said, "Look," he said, and sure enough, we found that army commander's diaries and all that, and usme, there were a lot of figures, there were a lot of maths. And we were not being able to interpret them. And somehow, instinctively, I knew this was all related to his calculations. That how can a man get the dates right here? It's as specific as that. And one day I was sitting in my study. I showed these books to my dad. I showed them to a lot of other generals. Nobody could make sense of it. And one day I was sitting in my study when my elder daughter came in and asked me, "Dad, did you do probability in school, in maths?" And I couldn't wait for her to leave because suddenly the penny had dropped. And I looked at those figures again and applied the probability theorems on them and arrived at the same dates. It was as simple as that. So the warnings were there, and yet when the attack came, we had the wrong people there, we got completely wiped out. We were wiped out. We were on Namkachu was my father's battalion. 282 men died in a matter of 1 hour. The whole casualties in Kargil were 500 over 50 days. In 1 hour, we lost 282 men. And our senior leadership broke and we ran from there. And the same thing happened in Ladakh. In Ladakh, we created all kinds of stories about ye ho gaya tha, wo ho gaya tha, ye ho gaya tha. But the Chinese came, they took what they wanted, then they withdrew. Because Mao had declared at that time that go in there, give them a slap, come back, and for the next 50 years, India will not be able to look us in the eye again. Now, under these circumstances, at the end of 1962, we were on our knees. We'd been thrashed. We had lost a war like a house of cards. I mean, we didn't even put up a semblance of a fight. If attack came on the 20th of October, by 20th of October evening, it was over. In a few hours, it was over. One battalion fought, the other battalions got up and ran away. There were some skirmishes after that at Bumla, etc. Nothing really mattered. And there were hardly a handful of troops really involved. And after that, the Chinese came in and it was like a knife through butter. We put up a stand at Sela. There was a gap of 1 month. After 1 month, they attacked again. It was absolute chaos. everybody ran. Why did we run? We were among the best troops in the world. How can the thing go so wrong? So my book actually gets into that. 1962 is called The War That Wasn't. And it actually completely named and said कि ये हुआ था, ये हुआ था, ये हुआ था. When I wrote this book, I really used to wonder who the hell's going to read it? Because it's a war which we lost. We lost it horribly. Everybody likes to read about a war where, you put up the Tiranga and you sang this and the guy got shot and then he still made a dialogue and he died and all that. That's the way movies portray it. That's not how it happens. 62, it got wiped out. Now, you cannot look at 1962 in isolation. You have to look at 1962 and 1965 as to what was going on. Pakistan, in the meantime, watching what is going on, Pakistan took one very pragmatic decision exactly a year later. Because the Chinese were going to build that highway, and there was no way. Pakistan had a choice. They could either fight China, like we did, and lose the Shashgaon Valley, or they could give it to them and become Pakistani Chini bye-bye. Ayub Khan said, over my dead body, not a square inch. He made the same statements in Nehru, but at the appropriate time, they went and signed this deal with China and they became blood brothers and all that kind of stuff. In the meantime, in 1956, even earlier, the Americans had already brought the Pakistanis into their fold because, as I said earlier, Pakistan was created for the oil fields. And that is something which is continuing even today. I mean, all the stuff going on in Afghanistan, everything is basically to have control of that region. The Pakistanis were now watching what had happened in 1962 and their own propaganda against India was building up like crazy. They used to call us buzdil, कि ये तो डरपोक है साले, ये तो भाग जाएगी. धोती पहन के आते हैं लड़ाई पे, इनको ठाठा दो गोलियां मारो, भागेंगे. They'll go so fast you won't know what's going on. And where did the action start? It started here, in Gujarat. In fact, when I wrote the 65 book, I landed in Ahmedabad, took a vehicle from here, and went and had a look at the run of Kutch, that whole Kanjar Court fort, etc., etc. Now, the old state of Kutch, that whole area is actually a dead sea. And on the western side of the boundary of Kutch is the province of Sindh. Sindh is hard ground, Kutch is a swamp. Kutch is a 100-kilometer wide swamp, and the Pakistanis by then were saying that apply the maritime law, since it's a dead sea. वहाँ पे आ जाता है पानी during the monsoons. They said that the maritime boundaries always run through the middle of a sea. Now, so what if it's a dead sea? Give us half of Kutch. We said no. So that was one of the disputes which were going on. But there was no way we could possibly defend a swamp. Because these guys were sitting up here and they were now armed with Patton tanks, and the Americans had given them everything that the NATO countries had. They had Sabre jets, which were F-86s, they had Patton tanks, they had Daphne submarines, and they had a tremendous amount of artillery, which gave them a huge advantage over us. And they were now, they'd seen India get thrashed by China, they'd seen us run, they felt, aha, आ गए, अब ये कहाँ जाएंगे, we will hit them so hard, here they will have to give us Kashmir. And that is what they did. They launched the initial attacks in Kanjar Court. The first attack happened against the Gujarat police post at a place called Sadar Post. These boys, there were just 25, 30 of them. They were CRPF chaps. They were not army. They actually did not run. They stood there and they fought. And they stopped a Pakistani brigade attack. And then there were all kinds of things which happened in the run of Kutch. And for the next 1 month or so, a little bit of fighting. But Pakistan had all the advantages. And they started projecting what was happening in the run of Kutch as a very major victory to the Pakistani people. अरे हिंदुस्तानी तो भाग गए, ये हो गया, वो हो गया, which is not actually the case. But public propaganda had built up. And by the time we come from May to June, but we come to May when the monsoons are beginning to start, the British intervened. Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister. They said, nahi, ceasefire, ye wo. Then, but it had already triggered off a whole series of events. Now, 60 had two major fallouts. One, after the war, the Americans were willing to help us because they were anti-communist and all that kind of stuff. But Mountbatten had come back to India immediately after the war in 63. And he got Nehru to release Sheikh Abdullah. And actually, the Indian delegation had gone to Pakistan to give away Kashmir. They decided the valley de do inko khatam karo, because Mountbatten, when he had come, he had tampered. I had earlier mentioned that Gurdaspur thing had happened with Nehru. He was Churchill's nephew. Churchill never spoke to him again. He said, "You have ruined the entire British plan. Go and rectify it." So he came back when Nehru was on his knees, and he got him to release Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah was with Ayub Khan. And then, fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you see history, Nehru died. And Nehru's death sabotaged the giving away of the valley, otherwise the valley was gone. This was in 64. Now, when they were so close to it, and then they didn't get it again. So they launched what happened in the run of Kutch. After which there was some more fighting, etc., etc., and then they launched Operation Gibraltar, where again they sent in tribals into Kashmir. But by this time we had a very diminutive, but a man with a lot of guts, who we can only have praise for, was Lal Bahadur Shastri. He shares the same birth date as Mahatma Gandhi, and he's also born on 2nd October. But he was willing to fight. And in 1965, the initial onslaught of what happened when the tribals came, etc., the Indian Army gradually started to regain ground. And then we had a very interesting army commander, a chap called Harbaksh Singh, who was very aggressive. Okay, a lot of his aggression actually backfired in the subsequent fighting in the Lahore and Punjab sectors. But one thing he did in Kashmir, that when we were on our knees, instead of saying, "Ki, acha, aa jao, kya kare, let's fight them," in a reactive manner, he went and he got behind the raiders, and we cut off Haji Pir, and we took the Kishanganga Valley, which is the Gurez Valley. Now, those are the two major infiltration points into the valley even today. And suddenly we had cut that off, and ये जो अंदर आ गए थे हमारी एरिया में, आप कोई भी हो गए ना, आपका अगर एग्जिट रूट ब्लॉक हो गया ना, you had it, because then your will to fight starts to go down, especially when you start getting killed. So the Indian Army started knocking these guys off, and then of course there was a lot of fighting which happened. The matter went into the fighting escalated. We got into Punjab, Gujarat, Rajasthan. All sectors were blazing at that time. Now, as the fighting intensified, we had one tremendous opportunity now, which was to actually decimate Pakistan completely at that time. By decimate, I don't mean knock off their populations. We had been stopped on the Ichugal Canal by the Pakistanis, so we had not got the kind of territorial gains we had expected, but we had enough. We had taken the area right up till the Ravi, and Lahore was being threatened, Sialkot was being threatened, and the Pakistanis, who had a lot of firepower and a lot of ammunition, were running out of ammunition very quickly. They were down to 13% of their ammunition on the 23rd of September, when Nehru has called the army chief, that time General Chaudhary, and said, sorry, I'm saying Nehru, Shastri called him and said, how much more time do you want? Because the world was really pressing on him, all that Tashkent business was going to happen, to call a ceasefire. So the moment Pakistan started losing, the Western countries all jumped in and said, no, had Pakistan been winning, there would have been none of this nonsense about a ceasefire. So there was a lot of pressure. So he called Chaudhary and he said, how much more time do you want? And Chaudhary made the biggest mistake of his life, where he went and said, we are running out of ammunition. We are down to 13%. We had actually expended only 13% of our ammunition. And Pakistan was on its knees because they were left with 13%. I mean, there was nothing left to fight with. What were they going to do? So the whole attrition section was over. And when we were poised to go, the chief gave the government the wrong advice. And what happened after that? We all know. Because for the next 6 years, Pakistan regrouped. The elections which happened, the rise of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, all those things began to happen. 3 million Bengalis were killed. And then finally, in 1971, the entire dynamics changed. We had to go in again, this time on the eastern sector. And the Indian Army at that time went in and they literally liberated Bangladesh had created a new country. Now in 71 is actually a very major moment in not only in India's history, but also in the history of warfare. Because after World War II, whether you take Korea, whether you take Vietnam, whether you take anything that has happened anywhere in the world, this was the first time that through a feat of arms, that a country has gone in and liberated another country and achieved a military objective. And not only that, we did it in 14 days. It was an incredible victory. So here we now, the reason I'm giving you a quick overview of 47, 48, 62, 65, and then 71, you can see what happened. 47, 48, we performed reasonably well. We managed to push the Pakistanis back. For political reasons, our own leadership stopped us. In 62, when the Chinese came up, we crumbled like a house of cards, mainly thanks to our own political leadership, not because of the men. That's a point which I'm very categorical about in the book, and this is accepted by just about everybody. Because without leadership, even the best troops in the world will not be able to fight. And by tampering with the leadership and putting people there which Nehru wanted, he made a big mistake. Then we come to 1965. You have a man like Shastri who was willing to back his army. Initially, we were on the ropes. Everywhere the Pakistanis had an advantage because they were the ones who were leading the attacks. They started the run of Kutch operations. They were the ones who started the Operation Gibraltar when they came in. So whoever comes in first has the initial advantage, especially if you're not prepared for it. Then they hit us with Grand Slam in Cham when we captured Haji Pir and everything. When they found कि वहाँ पे things are going wrong, उन्होंने जाके Cham में एक sector खोल दिया. Then we, for the first time, thanks to Shastri, we took the initiative and attacked them in Punjab and in Rajasthan. We went for Lahore, we went for Sialkot. Suddenly, the whole equation changed, and gradually, and it was a war of attrition. So there was no spectacular wins or anything of the sort. In fact, a lot of people used to say that the 1965 war was actually a draw. But I have argued in the book saying, no, it's not. Because what were the Pakistani objectives? The objectives were A, to hit us in the run of Kutch, do this, take concessions in Kashmir. That didn't happen. They went in there. We managed to stop them every time. And sometimes a defensive battle, winning a defensive battle is more difficult to pinpoint because offensive battle is easier to say, okay, I went in, I captured that is mine. So I won the war. Defensive battle, even like Kargil, where we cleared our own posts, are hard to define. So we've had this, you can see the pendulum, 47, 48, and it's 1 year of fighting, massive fighting in some of the worst possible terrain. We acquitted ourselves very well, but let down by the political leadership. 1962, political leadership, military leadership, everything fails. One massive mess. Come to 65, you can see the rebuilding of the blocks, as it were. You can actually see the rebuilding of Indian character. It's like a cricket match. You lost two early wickets, and the third guy is coming in and digging in, and now he's blocking, and he's trying to bat his way through, and then he starts attacking back. That's exactly what happened. And then the events start unfolding, and Pakistan starts to unwind. The kind of atrocities, etc., which were then unleashed in East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, have to be seen to be believed. My father's battalion was involved in the Battle of Ashuganj. I mean, I was a 11-year-old kid. I have been to villages. The women had been raped, murdered, shot. Their breasts had been cut off. The men mutilated. It was village after village after village after village, bodies after bodies after bodies after bodies. 3 million dead. And guess what? The West says it's not a genocide. Even today, Pakistan has never been branded as a genocide country because the UN has never said that the 71 war was a genocide. Why? Because they say what happened with the Jews, that was a genocide. What happened here was not a genocide. And the irony, ladies and gentlemen, is that it wasn't only the Pakistani army which did all this. The Pakistani army probably killed about 5 lakh people, which is about 0.5 million. They went after the intellectuals at the Dhaka University killings, etc. Operation Searchlight. Most of the killings happened with the Razakars. And who were the Razakars? The Razakars were the Bengali Muslim population which had migrated to Bengal They formed the paramilitary troops. They were like your BSF and CRPF and your Gujarat State Armed Police and whatever, Punjab Police. These were the guys. And if you look at the casualties, they would be the ones who would know ki kaun kahan rehta hai, etc. Army generally doesn't know. When they go into an area, their intelligence isn't of that type to be able to go and indulge in that kind of a massacre. What happened in Bangladesh after that is again something which is it was one of the greatest victories that happened, but with the assassination of Mujibur Rahman, the whole thing went ulta. Because now you had this hardcore element coming in, including Ershad and General Zia and everybody, and they just wiped out the plate. Today you go to Dhaka, they've got one museum and one memorial which says the Indian Army was there. Otherwise, it's all about how we never existed. You talk to the Bangladesh chap on the street, he said, हाँ 71 में कुछ हुआ था, हाँ इंडिया है, चारों तरफ उन्होंने हम पे हमला किया होगा. They don't know. We are the people who actually liberated. But in the overall historical context, 1971 then there's no two ways about it. It was a war which we completely and absolutely pulverized Pakistan, and Pakistan will never forget it. Because they also lost 93,000 men which were captured. And then again, it was a huge diplomatic failure again because we returned those guys without solving the Kashmir problem. We, in fact, not only did not solve the problem, we left it wide open. Siachen happened later because the boundary was only demarcated up to a particular point. We had an opportunity here, but again, Bhutto completely swung circles around Mrs. Gandhi on the diplomatic table. Bhutto was a talker. He could get what he wanted. He was a real dramabaz. तो बोला कि आप मेरे को ये दे दो, मेरा क्या होगा, ये होगा, वो रोने लगी इसी से, चलो ले लो यार. So India has had a post-independent history which has gone like a pendulum. It has swung from disaster from complete defeat to victory. And these are wars which all of you, I feel, need to really study. In fact, what we are doing now is we are taking it to schools. Sana is here. She's running the military history capsule in Vellum Boys School in Dehradun, where we have all the major schools of India attending it. They come from Bangladesh, they come from Guwahati, they come from Quilon, they come from various parts. We've been running it for 6 years. But here's the irony. Vellum Boys is the only school in India which is teaching military history. Even your Indian Military Academy is not teaching military history. Even your National Defense Academy is not teaching military history. Nobody is teaching military history. And what military history we know is all British history. What actually happened? How did things unfold? And to understand military history, most importantly, you first have to know the military geography of your country. And there is no such thing as military geography because military geography and geography is exactly the same thing. You know where your rivers are, you know where your hills are, you know where you are. You know when you're sitting in Ahmedabad, how far is the sea, exactly what is going on here, where do the Aravalis go, where is this happening, what happened in various kingdoms, how did the thing go. That whole thing needs to be understood because we face it. Your military history is not going away. It comes back and bites you in the butt every now and then. And unless you are fully aware of it, you will never be able to stand up to it when it comes as a wave again. And it can hit you anywhere. If you think you're sitting in, a particular part of country which has not had problems, you're sadly mistaken because every area, it flares up every now and then. And the more aware you are of national security issues, the more you're capable of dealing with it. When we started teaching military history in Vellums, there was a lot of criticism. Oh, you chaps are trying to teach them, you're making it into a military school. But we were not. In fact, our objective has been completely the opposite. I've shot the Kargil War. Every night before I go to sleep, I pray that your generations do not have to see a war. It's very romantic, okay? Shooting a war, everybody says, oh, great. Fighters, tanks, guns going off. But you see a man die, see a man being shot, you see the life ebb out of his eyes, got 3 daughters, got a wife. You see him being cremated, come down to ashes. Then it doesn't matter whether he's an Indian soldier or a Pakistani soldier, the human being, and we then begin to realize ki ho kya raha hai. So the more you understand your own military history, the more you get into exactly what happened, the more you're going to be prepared mentally to take the right decisions when you are faced with it. Because let me tell you, human nature is such, it's going to hit you in the face sooner or later. We may be going through a particular period right now where, certain terrorist attacks are not there, but most of you remember what happened in Bombay. You all remember what happened. It keeps happening. It's a cycle. The only way to fight that cycle is to understand military history. Look at India as Fortress India. Do not let those fault lines come in. You cannot afford to have any of this communal stuff about Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. We are all Indians. The day we understand that, that's the only chance we actually have. Because, again, to quote President Roosevelt, if you want to walk alone and survive in this world, you better carry a big stick. That's the only way to do it. And the only way to do it is to understand exactly who we are, where we are. Thank you very much.